This is part 2 for chapter 10, and we only have a little bit left of this chapter just to kind of review associated with muscle and how muscles work. So in the previous video, we looked at the cross-bridge cycle and how muscles do contractions. And we learned that in order for the myosin head to become active, in order to do the contraction, the shortening of the sarcomere, we need a lot of ATP. And so it's not surprising to you that muscle fibers have a lot of mitochondria in order to make ATP. If you remember, the mitochondria, or the powerhouse of the cell, its whole purpose is to do cellular respiration, in which it does aerobic ATP production. Aerobic, we know, means that it needs oxygen in order to produce ATP, and the two cycles that occur inside the mitochondria are going to be the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, and then electron transport chain. And we know that they need an aerobic or oxygen-rich environment in order to accomplish this. Inside your muscles, there are a few other things that kind of help this process so that we continuously have a good supply of ATP. One of which is a protein called myoglobin, and myoglobin stores extra oxygen inside the muscle fibers so that we can have a decent oxygen supply to the mitochondria so it can do ATP production. Another thing that muscles have is storages of glycogen. Remember, glycogen is a polysaccharide, so a complex sugar that can be broken down into simple sugars like glucose, which we know glucose is needed in order to do glycolysis, which is the first part of cellular respiration. And then lastly, particular to muscles, we have two kind of compounds. We have creatinine and creatine, okay, phosphates. And creatine are very similar compounds. Creatinine is a broken down or product of creatine, okay? So we'll use them kind of interchangeably here at least. And creatine or creatinine phosphate, this is going to actually provide us with phosphate groups when we are trying to replenish ATP quickly. So again, just to kind of review, this is how we have oxygen, not oxygen, excuse me, ATP for the muscle cells so they can continue doing muscular contractions. We have creatine phosphate, which is going to donate phosphate groups so that we can change ADP into ATP. We have glycogen storages that break down into glucose so we can complete glycolysis, which is the first part of our cellular respiration cycle. And then inside the mitochondria, we do aerobic cellular respiration in the form of the Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, so we can make a ton of ATP for these muscle cells so they can keep going. This is just a small aside for creatine phosphate because it is donating those phosphate groups. Okay, so creatine phosphate has phosphate groups that are in high energy bonds attached to creatine. And this phosphate group can be given to ADP inside the muscle fiber so it can form more ATP. And the way that it does this is we have a enzyme here called creatine kinase. Creatine kinase will break apart these high energy bonds in creatine phosphate so that that phosphate group is available so that we can make ATP. Again, just going through glycolysis, this is just a review. Remember, this occurs in the cytosol. It's an anaerobic process, and this is essentially what we're doing with that glucose to kind of start the cycle for making ATP. And then that cycle finishes inside the mitochondria where we need oxygen in order to complete the other two cycles to make the most ATP for the muscle cell. We did learn in a previous chapter what happens if we don't have enough oxygen and we cannot complete the aerobic respiration cycle inside the mitochondria. We know that our pyruvate, which is produced by glycolysis, is going to eventually form lactate, okay? Lactate can be used as a fuel, but once it starts breaking down, it can form lactic acid, and that lactic acid can get built up into muscles and cause pain, and it is an indicator that we don't have enough oxygen supply to those muscles. This brings about the kind of term oxygen debt. There is a specific oxygen debt for every part of the body that needs oxygen, muscles included. And if we do not meet that oxygen debt, we're not bringing in enough oxygen, either because we're doing too excessive of exercises or things of that flavor, then we need to get additional oxygen from other places, or we end up forming lactic acid in our muscles until the oxygen conditions change. So we talked just briefly about exercise, maybe creating a higher oxygen debt, okay, that the muscles can't pay. And so we just want to talk about exercise real quick, okay? Um, if we work out our muscles more, okay, and we are we're creating a higher workload on those cells through endurance exercise, we may end up creating more mitochondria, which can kind of take care of that issue of oxygen debt. Certain exercises like resistance exercise, where we're actually increasing the size of the muscle cells, okay, can lead to a condition of the cell called hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is when your muscle cells get bigger, okay, or any cell type for that matter. Hypertrophy is when cells become larger. We're not making more cells, we're just making these cells larger. Sometimes in muscle cells, when we do resistance exercises, you can create some additional fibers, and that would be hyperplasia. This is when we make more cells. Okay, this would mean that the cells are going through mitosis. Okay, but largely when we do resistance exercises with muscle cells, mostly they just get larger, hypertrophy. On the flip side, if there's a lack of exercise and those muscle cells have a reduced workload, okay, they don't need to work that hard because you're not using them, those cells could decrease in size, which we would term atrophy. So atrophy is when cells decrease in size. Hypertrophy is when cells get larger in size. And hyperplasia is a term for when we actually make more cells. To finish off this chapter, we have to talk about two other types of muscle tissue, cardiac muscle tissue and smooth muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle tissue, we're just going to very briefly go through because in part 2 of this course, you will be having a whole chapter on the cardiovascular system where you will learn more about cardiac muscle cells. We're just going to do something briefly here. So for our cardiac muscle fibers, they are a little bit different than skeletal muscle, although they act very similar, okay? They have branches. So we saw with those skeletal muscle fibers in the previous slides that they're just kind of bundles of cylindrical tubes. But here we do have the bundles with the cardiac muscle fibers, but they're branched instead. That's how they're connected. And each of these branches is connected by a structure called an intercalated disc. That is something very specific to cardiac muscle cells. And those intercalated discs contain two of our cellular junctions, which are desmosomes and gap junctions. In addition, cardiac muscle cells are striated. They contain sarcomeres just like skeletal muscle. They contain a ton of mitochondria because we want to keep making ATP. Their nuclei are a little bit different. We saw in skeletal muscle that they have multiple nuclei and they get kind of pushed out to the sides of the cell. In cardiac muscle, there's usually one, maybe two nuclei, and it's usually in the center of the cell. Cardiac muscle works a little differently than skeletal muscle in that it has other cells, okay, which we are just going to call pacemaker cells, which are autorhythmic, meaning that all of the cardiac muscle cells with their branches and with their intercalated disc connecting them together, they all move as one. They're autorhythmic. They all contract together and move together. This is a little bit different than what we see with other types of cells. And lastly, this little point here, the heart rate and contraction force are influenced by autonomic nervous system. We're going to get into the autonomic nervous system, I believe, in chapter 15. This is simply just saying that our cardiac muscle cells are under involuntary control. We do not control when these contract. This is subconscious signaling from the brain. We are going to switch over to smooth muscle to kind of finish up this chapter. Smooth muscle cells are a little bit different. They're spindle shapes. They do not have striations. They don't have very nicely set sarcomeres. Their filaments are actually arranged randomly. So they look a little bit different, and you're not going to see striations in these cells. They still have a sarcolemma. which has a lot of different calcium channels on it because we need to make sure calcium makes it inside the cell in order to start the muscle contraction, just like we've seen for the others. But their sarcoplasmic reticulum, that structure inside skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle cells, which stores and releases calcium, is not really present in smooth muscle. So they really, really do need all these different calcium channels to make sure that we can contract smooth muscle by having calcium enter the cell one way or another. I am not going to test you on this, but in case you are interested, and if you're not interested, feel free to skip this slide. This is how smooth muscle actually does muscle contraction, since it does act a bit differently than cardiac or skeletal muscle. Because those fibers, and it still has actin and myosin fibers, because those fibers are kind of arranged randomly. They don't form those nice cross bridges that form striations that we would normally see. They still form bridges, but we call them latch bridge mechanisms, and they're a little bit different. And there's a couple different proteins present here that are not present in skeletal or cardiac muscle. So again, just in case you're interested, feel free to read through this. I do want you to know where we find smooth muscle in the body and the two different types. Smooth muscle is found in a variety of different organ systems. It is involuntary, so these organ systems are going to receive subconscious signaling from the brain in order for them to contract and move things through. Your blood vessels do this. Bronchioles, which are part of your respiratory system, do this to move air through the system. Your intestines do this to mix and propel materials through that system. Your ureters do this to move urine from the kidneys to the bladder. And in the female reproductive system, the uterus does this in order to move materials like unfertilized eggs or even parts of the lining of the uterus out of the body. So there are two categories that we have for smooth muscle. One is multi-unit, the other is single unit. Multi-unit smooth muscles, these are different units that receive stimulation to contract individually. So even though we have a bunch of different units of smooth muscle in an area, they each receive their own individual stimulation, which means they can act a little bit differently. Okay, so some examples of this are the iris and ciliary muscles of the eye. Your iris is the colored portion of your eye. We will get into that when we get through the eye in the nervous system. And the opening and closing of your pupil, the dilation and constriction of your pupil, which is a hole in your eye, is controlled by multi-unit smooth muscle. Erector pili, we should recognize this causes goosebumps for hair follicles on the skin. That is multi-unit smooth muscle. Most of our larger air passageways are made of multi-unit smooth muscle, and larger walls of arteries are made of this type of smooth muscle. And it can have different effects depending on the type of stimulation it receives. The last type is single unit or visceral smooth muscle. And if you remember, visceral means internal organs. Okay, so this is the most common type. We find it on most of our blood vessels, okay, and most of our, not reproductive, but most of our internal organs, digestive, urinary, and reproductive. And so this type of muscle, even though we have the cells together in their own unit, they contract in unison. Because of gap junctions present within these cells. So single unit, always think of this referring to internal organs as well as blood vessels for this one.